All right, so after we've gotten through understanding the colored pencil techniques to give the characters depth, we need to put the characters somewhere. All right, so the decisions you made on your practice sheet to figure out where the characters need to go, what setting they're in, and what the scenes are going to be like, you've got to start thinking about how am I going to carry that out? And in which of the individual cells am I going to do that? So again, with my planning sheet, I came up with brick walls, alleyways, buildings, cityscapes, those kinds of places. And I actually created a brick wall here partially because of the coloring on the clothing. So I made a conscious choice on, what type of background I'm going to have based on the colors that I'm going to have for the characters, the most important part. So what I want to do is how do I figure out where they're going to be? But first and foremost, I have to put them in a place. These characters right now are floating. There's nothing telling me that there's a ground other than the fact that their feet, visually, we would assume would be touching something. So what I did here was I established some depth. I established the horizontal plane that the characters are standing on. Then what I established was the space behind. All right, this is the wall in the alleyway. So I assumed that I could visually tell the story by adding in a horizon line back here and then developing the space. In this instance, there's nothing that I could really do in the background similarly to this. There's really not much I could do. So what I did was I went in and I just developed a color that would create some contrast, not take the focus off of the character in that scene. I could also have the option of a lot of the backgrounds that I saw when I did my search. A lot of the backgrounds that I saw had that similar, comic illustration energy, all right, that information of the background where you have those moving shapes and so forth, right, like you can see here. So I kind of took this idea with this sunburst effect, and I did that in the background of this one, where it's just a tall, thin rectangle. All right, I labeled areas where I was going to have different walls. All right, over here I got a cinder block wall. All right, alleyway. All right, when I look at the alleyway, one of the things that you notice when you see this is that exaggerated perspective. Okay, and if you looked at any other references, you'd see that exaggerated perspective of the spaces in which the characters are taking up. So obviously, I could gain inspiration from some of these instances. And in fact, this looks like it could totally be the scene or the setting. But you notice that perspective, that one-point perspective in this case, it's all going back to this tiny space. The characters can appear to be popping out at us as we go into this or view this space. So I'm going to kind of keep this as reference, but I'm going to change it enough for what I need for my example. So I'm just going to set that aside, and that's what I did here. I established first, here's the foreground where the guy's foot is, and then I picked a point that made sense. So I used my pencil and I drew back the ground line of the building on the left and the ground line of the building on the right. So there'd be a one-point perspective dot somewhere back in space over here. And then, of course, again, with the rules of perspective, verticals are always vertical. Not always vertical in comic books, but in this case, I wanted it to appear as if this was a realistic setting. All right. So I closed off the space going back. I established the ground by putting in just some rough reference lines like you might see the ground might look like. Going back into a space, you can see some of those horizontals. And in this case, too, you can see some lines going back in space, helping to define that area. Now, of course, you have the option of developing any type of background you want, but the first thing you have to do is have some reference, have an idea of what and where the characters are going to be, and then establish the ground. So, as I said, in this one, I created a horizon behind the characters, establishing the depth. Doesn't have to be a perfectly horizontal here, but with the brick wall, I wanted it to appear as if it was shooting straight on visually. So I just, with my pencil, lightly create a horizon line. That establishes the foreground, midground, and background. And now if I'm going to do a brick wall, there's some tricks to understanding what brick walls look like. You can see the bricks are stacked. Common mistake students make when they're drawing bricks is they'll draw a grid like this, and that's not what bricks look like. That's not how bricks are stacked. The best thing to do in drawing bricks is, if you look at this example here, is obviously you have to follow the horizontal because the bricks are going to be laid on that horizontal surface plane. So the best way to look at bricks is I use a light line. Obviously I need to maintain the parallel, all right, the same distance from here to here, here to here. So when I establish the same distance there, I'm just kind of using a light line and trying to maintain an accurate space. Then what you have to know is, once you establish that first, if this is the edge of the wall here, once you establish the width of the first brick, all right, you have to kind of maintain some uniformity, all right, with the width of the bricks. And then again, bricks are always staggered, usually half on the seam. So the middle of the brick on top is on the seam of the one below. So the brick pattern, you can see I'm just kind of sketching lines in, a little bit of expressive line that keeps it a little bit looser and a little bit more lifelike. All right, so you can kind of see how I put them in here. Because when I go to color them, I need to make sure that I leave the mortar, which is the light stuff between the bricks, I need to leave that light. So basically my pencil lines become the mortar, and then when I put the color in, all I have to do is leave a little bit of space for all I have to do is leave a little space, and I'm using the Tuscan Red. It's a really good brick color. All right, see what I'm doing here. I'm not outlining, I'm just putting in the edge of the brick. And I'll just kind of do this real quick. All right, leaving space above and below so that the bricks give the appearance of the mortar in between them. Which can be just a thin area of light because it's going to vary. The mortar thickness is usually a similar thickness, but it's background. So I don't have to worry too much about it being perfectly geometric because it's an organic subject and it's only the background. So you can see I left a little bit of white everywhere around the bricks. That's the mortar. And I got those rectangular shapes, and then my pencil lines in between almost disappear to create the appearance of the brick. And I can always touch that up. I can add a little bit of intensity on some of the bricks, so on and so forth. All right. The other concept here is the cinder blocks. They're the same thing, but they're just thicker. All right, so here in this example where you can see I have both brick and cinder block, if I'm going on a diagonal like this, with going back in space with perspective, you just have to remember the verticals are vertical, those rules of perspective. So here with the bricks, the edges of the bricks need to be vertical. That's why I did them the way I did, because they're going back in space. All right. Same thing with these. So if I'm looking at bricks in perspective, and I've got a brick wall going back like this, like I have there, obviously my lines of the brick are going to go the same thing. They're going to be parallel. All right, the horizontal lines going back in space are going to be parallel. But the verticals on the bricks now have to stay vertical. And again, they're going to be every staggered in between. All right, so you can see the concept of perspective we've talked a lot about earlier on coming into play here. Understanding reality of space and depth. Okay, and I'm not trying to make all of my lines that dark because obviously I've got to put the color in between, but I have to follow the rules of perspective. Same thing holds true if I'm going back the other direction with cinder block. Okay, here's the ground line, here's the vertical. The cinder blocks, same thing. It's just going to be a little bit thicker. And the lines are going to be parallel. Maybe the edge of the building is cracked or broken. Right? I can be as creative as I want with that. So the cinder blocks are going to go back in space parallel. And it's going to have the same effect. So the cinder block here, and I like drawing it really loose with the cinder blocks. Kind of stagger it Put a little bit of split in between, right? I have a double line there because usually the mortar in Cinder Blocks is a little bit thicker. And I'm kind of rounding off the edge a little bit. But again, I have to make sure that my vertical lines of those cinder blocks stay vertical. Rules of perspective, in this case, need to apply. All right, so you can see I got that look of cinder block. And then, of course, I could come into it. See how I did it here. I could come into it. I let the pencil lines create the edges of the mortar. And then I used the colored pencil and some blue, created some accent. I created a little cast shadow on the back wall down here. The color of the shoes I changed a little bit from my original thought because the gray against the gray didn't work. All right. And here's a good example in this last cell of how the brick wall could look in the background. I had to follow the angle of the ground line. Like I mentioned here, I had to follow that angle of the ground line going back. So I used a ruler and I just followed all of the angle where the ground line goes. So as I drew the lines going back here, if it's brick, cinder, whatever, okay, this right here is the ground line. So when I drew the first row, let's say I'm going to go cinder block, all right, it's going to be a slightly thicker line, and I would draw that slightly thicker line anywhere that is background. So there's my first row of cinder blocks going back in space. And as I work my way up, I have to maintain that same distance. So I'm just keeping the ruler right where it is. And I'm keeping these lines parallel to the ground line, which again, the ground line is here. And I put the next, keeping my light pencil mark, because I want the colored pencil to create the stronger look of the cinder block. Now I've got the cinder blocks going through and behind the characters. Some students in the past have chosen to make this a fence. Some students have chosen to make it a cement wall that had some cracks in it. You could look up cracked cement. All right, so you can see I'm getting the horizontals established correctly based on perspective. Oops, I missed a line right here. Okay, so there's my horizontals for my lines going back in space. And now I would just need to decide, again, the vertical's got to be vertical. So if I'm doing cinder block, I would have the cinder block start to pick up, wherever the lines are. And then I would begin to stagger. One here, here, okay. All right, so that gives me a good understanding of the background and how I'm going to develop these characters into a space, as well as the perspective that's needed in order to correctly and accurately develop the space for my characters.